It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
They're multi-billion-pound companies. It's their job to serve customers and the environment, and that's why we're holding them to account for failing to do so.
Up to £10 off your water bill, but is the regulator being tough enough on the water companies?
I have been left with a £22 billion black hole. I inherited a £22 billion black hole. There was a £22 billion black hole in the public finances.
But will the Chancellor's proposed tax rises raise the revenue she hopes? As blast furnaces face closure, is British-made steel worth saving? And Conservative MPs vote within the hour to eliminate one of these four from the leadership contest. Joining us today, Labour MP Clive Lewis, Tees Valley Mayor and Conservative peer Ben Houchen, Observer columnist Sonia Soda and Elliot Keck from the Taxpayers Alliance, a think tank that campaigns for lower taxes. This is Politics Live. Let's start with this headline in BBC News. Water companies must return £158 million over poor performance. Yes, you saw there in the headlines, Ofwat, the regulator, they've released their annual report and state that water companies must pay what they call an underperformance payment of that amount to customers in lower bills. But it's not actually clear whether this will benefit customers very much, as bills are already due to go up in April, and this, of course, against a background of water companies making £1.7 billion in profit. So my opening question, starting with you, Clive, is Ofwat being tough enough on water companies? No, it's not, and it never will be. And I think there needs to be kind of root and branch reform of the entire sector, including the regulator. You know, whatever customers get back, I think it's around about £10 off their bill. We know over the next 5 years that Ofwat has allowed the water companies to charge an extra £95 for the average household over the next few years. So, you know, OK, great, we're getting some money back. But actually, this is all about the symptoms, the actual root structural causes of this. What would you like to see? Root and branch reform is... So that would be, you know, I'd like to see a water act. That was, no, not nationalisation. OK. Not nationalisation. Public ownership. There is a difference. You know, I don't want to go down to a top-down. You know, if Thames Water goes into, you know, special administration, that's going to be a top-down kind of command and control of water. We can think of something far more creative, I think, in the 21st century, which allows for transparency, accountability, and some form of public ownership. All right, Elliot, is Ofwat being tough enough on water companies?
I think to me this is a bit of a gimmick. Clive is right to say that they're going to allow water companies to rise bills by £94 over the next few years. That's because actually, in order to fix Britain's sewage system, most of which is, or at least 40% of which is still Victorian sewage system, where the sewage and rain is actually combined, there's just going to be a huge amount of investment. That's going to require either taxpayers' money, if that's, you know, if it was something like nationalised or if it came from government grants, or that's going to require bill payers' money. So the fundamental reality is whatever problems there are in water, whatever problems you want to talk about in terms of profits and dividends and all the rest of it, the ultimate problem is we do not spend enough money on making our waterways better. So those higher bills would be justified in order to fund that investment? Yeah, listen, you have to pick one or the other. For 20 years in this country, we didn't see real terms increases in water bills. That's because generally the regulator preferred keeping water bills low. That is a virtue in and of itself. That means people don't have to spend as much money on water as otherwise. But if the public's priorities are now actually having safer, cleaner waters and rivers, and that's fine, I think that's a completely legitimate priority, that does mean that somebody's going to need to pay more. Clive? The water companies are £60 billion in debt. They were privatised debt-free when they were privatised under Margaret Thatcher, and now, you know, they've paid £78 billion in dividend payments. So there was a little bit more of a choice there as to where some of that money went. They fundamentally, as a privatised industry, have failed to invest in the future of this country. Yeah, I completely agree. It's a structural issue. We've got water companies like Thames Water that have been owned by private equity, that have asset strip, loaded these companies up with debt so they don't have to pay any tax in the UK, which is dreadful in and of itself. And basically, they've just been extracting cash from bill payers rather than investing in the system. So some of those resources were there. It's just that the resources have leached out to pay dividends to some already very wealthy owners. We need a total restructure, I think, of the system, and we need to have some form of social purpose water companies, not companies that are there purely to make as much profit as they can without the long-term investment that bill payers need. What do you think, Ben?
Well, I do think it's a bit of a gimmick in that the Ofwat are trying to demonstrate that they are useful and are meeting the public's needs. But £10 off everybody's water bill, when I think my water bill's about £23 a month, it's not going to move the dial. And it goes back to the fundamental point that if you want to improve the water system, you want to get rid of sewage from our rivers, etc., it's going to require investment. Somebody has to pay for that. That's either the taxpayer or it's the shareholder. But Clive makes a really interesting point, because when they were privatised in the 80s, we had mass share ownership. And actually what happened over the years is private equity got involved, and we're able to, as everybody says, load these companies with debt. And actually, if there is I don't know how a government would do this effectively, because governments tend not to do this effectively, but if there was a way of reintroducing mass share ownership, because we're also seeing, separate to this, a commitment of £81 billion to invest in the infrastructure of water companies. Now, that's all great, but that's where your £94 increase is going, because it's to pay for that infrastructure. So ultimately, somebody's going to have to pay.
I mean, I think they're still deciding exactly what the price increase will be, but that's being negotiated.
But
it will be substantial. Let's talk about the next big political event coming up, because it is the budget. We've been waiting a long time, 30th of October. The question is, will the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, be able to raise the tax revenue that she hopes to partly at least fill the black hole you heard her repeatedly say in the headlines? She says she's been left by the previous government. Let's have a look at some of the headlines around this issue. The Guardian: Reeves opts to not raise tax on pension contributions in October budget. We had thought that might have been one of the options. BBC News: Treasury reconsidering Labour plan for non-dom tax status. You'll have heard a lot about that during the campaign. It was in the Labour manifesto. And in the Financial Times: Rachel Reeves to spare private equity bosses top UK tax rate in compromise on loophole. Two of those, the last two, Clive, were manifesto pledges by the now government. How do you feel about them potentially being watered down?
I mean, it's speculation, and I don't know if that's going to happen. And obviously, I imagine the government will say that they've come in, they've seen the black hole, and they've responded. But there are commitments, and I think there's a big issue here of trust. And I think that's one of the reasons why the issue around the winter fuel payment kind of was such a blow. And because people basically, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of millions of other people out there, voted for change. They wanted an NHS that works. They wanted their children sat in a class that wasn't crumbling. They wanted to have access to a dentist. That's going to take investment in public services. And as panellists have already said, that's going to mean that we're going to have to invest in those things. That's going to have to be paid for. And we're going to have to pay for that, I think. There are people in this country, organisations, corporations that can pay. The amount of GDP that's coming from wealth now has significantly ballooned compared to 10, 20, 30 years ago. So now we need to adjust our taxation system to take into account the fact that unearned income through investments, through stocks and shares, is generating far more wealth. And we now need to tap into that to pay for the public services that most people in this country want.
And you've been consistent about that. What do you think about that analysis? Is that the correct way to raise the money that the Chancellor needs, she says, for public services?
The reason why, when governments want to raise revenue, they raise taxes on income is because that's really the only, or VAT is because that's really the only effective way to raise large amounts of revenue. If you start meddling with things like capital gains tax, non-doms tax, all these different taxes, these are the taxes that target the wealthiest, the most mobile, the people who are most able to leave. And actually, listen, one of the things that the government have really pitched is that they're going to listen to the experts, they're going to listen to the OBR, officials in the Treasury, and lo and behold, those officials are telling them that's not going to raise you any money.
The problem is, of course, that Rachel Reeves and the now Labour government pledged not to raise the four big taxes, and they are looking for other pots of money to raise money from, and it doesn't look as if it's going to yield that much. What do you make of those headlines? Yes, speculation, but we already know that the money coming out, I mean, it could be under £5 billion, and even then, it might not even raise that.
Well, I think what's happened is that they've got into government, they've got into the Treasury, and they are discovering that some of these tax increases raise really marginal amounts. And actually, the IFS said, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, even going into the election, looking at Labour's manifesto, the tax rises that they were proposing were incremental. And then actually there may be factors in the real world that mean that you don't get all the money that are perhaps on an optimistic view you would. Now, the reason why that's tricky is because they have said that they're not going to raise any of the biggies. They're carrying the national insurance tax cut that has been done in recent years by Conservative governments. Was that a tax cut that we can afford? The Conservatives, in their spending projections before the last election, have paid for that through future projected spending cuts, which Labour have sort of accepted as a baseline. So Rachel Reeves has got an awesomely difficult problem, which is that we don't have enough public investment in this country. That harms growth. Current spending, we've got, public services in a complete state. She said that she's not going to spend anything on day-to-day spending that she doesn't get in through tax revenues. So if you want to fix the NHS, if you want to tackle child poverty, if you want to close the widening attainment gap between poor and richer children at school, if you want to get people back into work, how do you do these things without more upfront investment?
How do you do it then without a sort of wealth tax or equalising capital gains tax or whatever?
So obviously we know that Rachel Reeves is going to make two adjustments. One on the Bank of England and the fact that the Treasury have underwritten, covered the costs. The only central bank that has its costs covered by a Treasury in the Western world, as far as I understand it, that's a 2012 agreement. That's being changed. That will release £10 billion. And we also know that there will be some other changes that take place which allow for greater government investment. So for basically offsetting.
Yes, they're going to take some of the capital expenditure, perhaps like GB Energy. But will that work?
So I think it will give some headroom for the Chancellor, but I think she is going to have to make some difficult decisions. And look, the other thing that isn't being discussed here is, we've just had, a scandal, if you want to call it, or some media attention on people taking corporate hospitality money from wealthy people. And one of the key issues, I think, for many people is, in our democracy, we can see that our democracy has been skewed by wealth and power, by corporations, by individuals that have a lot of wealth, a lot of power, and a lot of influence on our politics. Dark money in politics, if you want, but that influence. And one of the things that taxation can do, it can take money from the wealthy, from the powerful, from those big corporations, and it can shift it to those things that we need. And that removes some of their political power as well, and I think that's good.
Well, it's a nice headline, but the Adam Smith Institute just this morning have published analysis that shows that 1 in 5 millionaires are expected to leave the United Kingdom over the next
Adam Smith Institute. I mean, the names, the clues in the title there.
Well, so you don't believe it. I mean, Ben, what do you think? Is it true? Let me show you and our viewers the headlines. The Daily Telegraph, Britain to suffer biggest exodus of millionaires in the world. It's expected to plunge by 20% over the course of this Parliament. And then there's another headline, Reeves urged to hit wealthy with exit tax as they flee Britain. Now, the top 1% of income taxpayers pay 29% of all income tax now, which is up from 25% in 2010, but they should be hit if they leave with some sort of exit tax. Do you think this is what's going to happen?
Well, it's already happening. I mean, if you look at the analysis, we're losing more millionaires in this country than any other country in the world outside of China. So, I mean, it demonstrably has an impact. If people are wealthy people, rightly or wrongly, and they're able to move to, North America, the Middle East, wherever it is, to be able to avoid these taxes, they're going to take advantage of that. I think, from my point of view, I think it's really interesting that we've kind of gone on to a conversation, and the one thing that Rachel Reeves has done incredibly well is move off where she started from. Where she started from was, we're not going to increase taxes other than those listed in the manifesto, which massively restricts actually what her manoeuvring is come the budget. She said she wasn't going to borrow more, and this Svengaling of the fiscal rules, where it actually means they're just going to borrow more, is a second thing. But they don't want austerity either. And we talked about growth, but growth, it seems to me, it's going to take a bit of a back step when it comes to the budget. And that's the problem that this government ultimately faces. If it wants to be honest with the public and it wants to stick to its manifesto commitments and what it said in the election, actually it's got very few levers to pull.
I think we should be clear that, personally, I think that relaxation of the rules around what counts as debt is really important. There are lots of experts calling for that. Yeah, because there is evidence. I think she's got more room to borrow on the market. It's an arbitrary fiscal rule. And if that money is going into investment that grows the economy rather than day-to-day spending, I think there's a clear justification for that. But that does not fix her day-to-day current spending problem. And if you've got something like child poverty, for example, we've got, independent organisations forecasting that the number of children, if nothing changes as a result of changes that the last Conservative government made, for example, around the two-child benefit cap, there are going to be 400,000 more children in poverty in 2029 as in 2024. So she's got to do something about that, but she's going to have to find the money to address child poverty.
Well, since you brought it up, let me just show you this headline in The Guardian. Rachel Reeves to decide by Wednesday whether to change fiscal rules. Now, the fiscal rules, as you said, I think earlier, inherited, or she's decided to stick to the Conservative fiscal rules, which is that debt should be falling in the 5th year by the end of the Parliament as a proportion of GDP. Do you agree with Sonia that that has to change or should change in order to borrow?
Yeah, a couple of points. Just to come back on the exit tax, this is the Berlin Wall of tax proposals. This is a tax proposal of a completely bankrupt country that is forcing its wealthy and successful citizens and residents to leave, and is trying to stop them from leaving.
I'd just like to challenge
on that, and I'll come back to you.
Let me quickly challenge that combination.
You don't
of words,
believe millionaires are already going?
Successful and wealthy. There are people. Michelle Mone is successful and is wealthy. Whether she's been successful in terms of making money, but the point I'm trying to make is,
but if they're leaving, is that a problem potentially? If they pay as much income tax as those figures actually say, nearly 30% of all income tax now is paid by the top 1% of income taxpayers, and if they are leaving, Ben Houchins, you think it's already happening?
So maybe we maybe we do need to look at the flows of capital and how mobile they are, and I think that's something. I'm being really honest here. I think most people have accepted that under Trump and Biden, globalisation, the limits of globalisation has taken place. It's now acknowledged that there are limits to that in terms of supply chains and how the economy works. Now, I'm not saying that we go into a completely isolationist phase, but I'm saying there is a conversation to be had about capital flows and about how they're controlled.
Everyone wants to come in, but go, you come first and I'll come back to you.
On the fiscal rules, the fifth largest item of government spending now is debt interest. £102 billion a year is spent on debt interest. If we didn't have that debt interest to spend, every single problem that we're talking about in this country could probably be solved by government revenues. So any fiscal change that leads to an increase in the national debt over the medium to long term and a competent increase in the debt interest and the amount that we're spending on servicing the debt is not, I don't think, is sustainable.
But that ignores the fact that we have historically low levels of investment in the UK. If you look over the last 40 years, and so there are different arguments about how you increase the amount of investment in your economy. But a lot of economists think that you need, if you look at our infrastructure, our transport infrastructure, for example, you need more public investment in infrastructure to leverage in the business investment. And it's not going to happen without that. We've never had enough business investment in this country for the last 40 years. So, you can make that argument, but you've also got to grow your way out of these debt interest payments. Okay. And it may well be that it's contingent on borrowing more to invest in order to get the growth that helps you pay off that interest. I think we're stuck in a funk at the moment as a country economically, which we've got low growth, low investment, and we've got terrible public services, terrible quality public services. And something has to change. Personally, I think you need more upfront government spending in order to grow the economy to pay some of that stuff back.
Would you agree with that increase in borrowing, changing the rules?
Well, I think for example, if you look at things like HS2, there was huge government spending on that. That spending bloomed. And actually, if you look at the official Treasury statistics, it shows that it's actually going to lose money. It's not adding to growth of the country. So for every £1 of public money spent, actually, you only recoup something like 90 pence of that money. So it's all very well.
There was terrible mismanagement.
No, absolutely. But this is
the
interesting. I'm not against public investment, right? As a mayor, we do a lot of public investment, as do the other mayors across the country. But we also have to question that the track record of central government of spending tens of billions of pounds on big capital infrastructure tends to go horribly, horribly wrong.
Right.
I also think, sorry, just very quickly, minor point. There's a naivety during the election that happened where they were promising to raise all the taxes that were listed, and particularly, for example, if you look at VAT on school fees, already official stats show that 10,000 children have left the private sector to go back into state school. We're going to see the same things if you raise corporation tax. We're going to see the same things if you raise capital gains tax. There needs to be a mature conversation, and I think what we're seeing being briefed very heavily is the realisation that they're having to row back from all of these things because it doesn't raise the money that they're saying is going to.
And I think, when you look at something like VAT on private schools, I think it's entirely justified. The issue is it raises a fairly incremental amount. It will pay for some change in the school system. Labour say 6,500
But it's a political, but there is a sort of political objective.
6,500 teachers, when you look at the number of schools in the country, it's incremental.
Look at where the public are. The public do not want more austerity. They voted overwhelmingly for change.
I agree.
They do not want more cuts. They do not want austerity. They want investment in public services. We have to make that happen.
This is a really interesting point because actually the Labour Party were really unclear before the election about what change actually meant. And the problem we've got now is they're trying to define change and they're realising it's not the type of change that the public actually want.
And the other big issue is that I think this government is too much being defined by fiscal conservatism. So if you look at every department, the reason why we don't know what they want to do is because they're not allowed to spend any money.
Well,
Let me just say one very fundamental point as well, is that the Financial Times asked a few weeks ago for the Treasury to outline and define the £22 billion black hole.
Yes.
The Treasury has failed to do that. So there is also a political...
I could define a big chunk of it.
Well, I can define it by a massive increase in trade union payouts for public sector workers.
Which was
as well.
what the pay review bodies were saying
but
anyway.
No, but irrespective
that's
of
what
that,
you would that's what Conservative
That is government by Quango, though. That is government
irrespective of that,
But the pay review bodies are what the government are.
It's based on evidence, though, looking at recruitment and
most-
retention issues in public
And
services.
most governments would have responded, but it has contributed, obviously, to higher spending.
It's the point that it fundamentally is there in the first place. It's in-year borrowing. And actually, by the way, let's take a step back. £22 billion is not even it's basically less than a rounding error for what the UK generates as GDP in the UK. So the idea that we're going to have to raise all these taxes or potentially see a level of austerity introduced by a Labour government is on a false premise of this £22 billion.
But
Well, let me
be
just
honest,
go...
That austerity was what was planned in by the last Conservative
Which
government.
the Labour government refused to talk about during the election.
But let's come back to
I
one of the choices that we've discussed, and that is about borrowing and how much more a government could borrow without spooking the markets. Always difficult judgment to make. Financial Times, although I'm not the Chancellor, thank goodness, UK borrowing costs climb as Chancellor Rachel Reeves walks tightrope over spending plans. Now, in this article, Mark Dowding, who's the Chief Investment Officer, RBC Blue Bay Asset Management, a catchy title, is quoted as saying the memory of the 2022 mini-budget was still etched into the psyche of gilt investors. What do you say to him?
Listen, I think ultimately the UK national debt's at 100% of GDP now. We spend £102 billion on debt interest. I think any government that adds massively to the government borrowing is doing something fiscally irresponsible in the long term. The Liz Truss government announced one of the largest spending packages in UK history, the energy plan. That was one of the things that spooked the markets. That was a disastrous policy, helped drive her down.
And the other side of that were the massive tax cuts. And at the time, the Taxpayers Alliance said, mini-budget, the most taxpayer-friendly budget in recent memory. And yet now, the memory of that budget is what potentially is making this government more cautious. Do you accept that? And do you accept you were wrong?
So we support tax cuts of any government, of any stripe.
Even if they have that kind of cost?
The other side of the ledger, and we said it at the same time on this exact same issue, was that the spending plan on energy costs, which was far, far higher than the tax cuts, was wildly irresponsible.
So you wanted tax cuts and more austerity?
We wanted, well, listen, we haven't had austerity in this country for many, many years. Government spending, government spending is at 46% of GDP now.
They're at 40.
Yeah, look at the NHS.
So because of how badly government spends money, it may appear that we have austerity, but government spending is at 46% of GDP. It's at £1.25 trillion pounds.
This is trickle down. It's a failed philosophy.
No, higher government spending is trickle down. Higher government spending is trickle down.
Hang on, don't all shout at once.
Just this point about how much Rachel Reeves can borrow. Then.
Yes,
so one of the
because if that is true, Sonia, and there is still the sort of ghost of that mini-budget looming, for whatever reason, both probably the spending increases and the tax cuts, then isn't it dangerous to go for that increased borrowing?
See, I think the markets, they are more sophisticated than thinking that it might. Well, in the sense that the reason why the 2022 mini budget sent the markets haywire was because they thought it was completely irresponsible and it wasn't linked to a plan for growth. I do think that there is space to borrow some more, not ridiculous amounts,
because bond yields are already going up.
But very carefully link it to exactly what you're going to be investing in. Is it the green transition, for example? I think if you could justify it as something that is going to help grow the economy, that helps keep the confidence of the markets.
I'm going to say something which I'm sure will be derided by the other panellists. But just you're reading from the FT, from someone. We're talking about, when I mentioned the term capital controls, that were used by post-war governments around the world for decades, quite comprehensively, quite effectively. But the kind of looks of, oh my. So the thing is,
people might ask which ones, I suppose.
That markets get to dictate how democracies spend their money is wrong. And there are millions of people out there that agree with that.
So how do you change that?
So, well, look what Margaret Thatcher did. Margaret Thatcher had the gumption to stand up with people like the Taxpayers Alliance and the funders behind them, had the gumption to stand up and completely revolutionise how our democracy works, how our economy works. We need a Thatcher of the left that will do the same for the public of this country and change the principles on which our economy and democracy are founded and the assumption.
Elliot's on your side, I think, on this.
In fairness, to some extent, I actually do agree with Clive. Firstly, we were founded in 2004. We can't take credit for the Thatcher Revolution. But we do have a problem. No, we do have a problem in this country that ultimately we have allowed bureaucrats to essentially dictate what UK government policy has been. Listen, VAT on private schools is an absolutely terrible policy, but there's no doubt that Labour were elected with a massive majority and have the mandate to do it. The fact that you now have bureaucrats and officials telling them, oh no, you can't actually do this, is a problem for democratic accountability. We need a massive strip down of bureaucracy, a massive return of political accountability, so that if politicians are elected to do something, whether that's a terrible policy in our view or a good policy in our view, they can actually do it. So I do have a lot of sympathy with Clive here, but this government are facing the same issues that the last government.
You're kidding me.
Ben.
Two quick, very specific points to make. One, it is a fact of life that the more the government borrows, the more it has an impact on interest rates.
Yeah.
We are seeing yields.
And you say the cost of debt interest is.
And so
that's partly because of what's going on in the US and growth in the US economy.
Absolutely, but as we saw at the time of the mini budget as well, there was lots going on elsewhere, but we saw the spike that they didn't in the same way because of what we did. So if we're going to borrow more, we have to be honest with the public that could increase interest rates, could increase people's mortgage rates, day-to-day borrowing. So that is a fact of life. The second thing that's really interesting, though, because you're saying whether this is kind of a spectre for this government, I think it is. I think from the people I've spoken to behind the scenes, the reason that the Labour government got into, for example, the winter fuel payment issue, where officials were basically saying, if you don't sign this off, we could find that this is going to spook the markets. That's what I've heard. And again, that's the rumours that I've heard from pretty credible people. That might not be quite right, but there is a lot of pushing to say you had to cut the winter fuel payment. So they're also, you've got civil servants and bureaucrats pushing politicians, newly elected, to say, oh, you don't want to be the next Liz Truss. So there's a whole series of
I think a member of the Cabinet said as much.
And the Labour government behind the scenes are absolutely petrified, which is why they're boxing themselves in.
I was going to say, if we get this wrong, Liam Byrne's already come out, the chair of the Commons Business and Trade Committee.
He's on next week.
He's already said we need to tackle the issue of the far right, which are benefiting from the lack of public services, from the despair that people face, and we need to find funds and resource to invest and tackle inequality. If we don't do that, we can see which way it's going to go. History shows us. So
again, we have to also be realistic that we are spending more on debt interest than I think any department spend that this government has, except for the NHS. So we're spending more than on education. We're spending more than on crime. We're spending more than on prisons.
But there are.
But then it's a vicious circle. At some point, you have to break it. At some point, you have to make an economic and political decision to say.
Is Keir Starmer the person to do that?
I think we will see.
Yeah.
I mean,
that sounds like a no.
So far, we've not had many clues about how Labour are going to break this funk that we're in. But to be fair, we have got a budget coming up. I think that will be the moment to really judge. If Rachel Reeves doesn't come out and it's a very difficult bind she's in, but if she doesn't have answers, including on child poverty, I keep coming back to child poverty, it's going to be rough for this Labour government.
Well, let's talk about the UK steel industry because, Ben, you have tweeted this. The last blast furnace, in fact, we announced it on the programme at the Port Talbot Steelworks closed. I thought it was the last.
No, the last one's still open in Scunthorpe.
So there's what?
There's one more left.
I said at Port Talbot.
Oh, so at Port Talbot.
Yes,
sorry.
at Port Talbot Steelworks. No, Ryan, I realised that. I know that's in your head, of course. Closed last month. So it did end traditional steel making in that area. Ben, you then tweeted this. I have written to the trade unions with an offer to work together to protect thousands of jobs and do what we can to save the UK steel industry. Our national security is at stake. The alternative is that for the first time ever, the UK will no longer produce its own steel. So what do you want the government to do?
The government are going to get themselves, if they're not careful, into a tricky bind where they want to invest in new steel-making facilities that are commercially viable, electric arc furnace technology, new green steel.
Yes.
Yeah, I know lots of people will deride the green element of that, but actually it can really help with the financial sustainability of steel in the UK. It can actually make us much less reliant on foreign imports because most, if not all, of our coal and coke that you make steel with comes in from abroad, but with electric arc furnaces, you don't rely on those imports as much. What the government are going to do, if they're not careful, though, is find themselves in a position where the last blast furnace in the UK, which means we no longer produce steel in the UK anymore, will close in Scunthorpe. if they don't get this right. And as a result, by definition, we are going to have to import steel. We've just seen that in Tartar in South Wales, where Tartar have just been given an exemption to import from India steel products to replace what we've lost. If British Steel goes, we're now then completely exposed to the global market.
How long do you think you've got then in Scunthorpe for that final blast furnace?
I don't know the specifics, and to be fair, we are working very closely with Johnny Reynolds, the Secretary of State, on this, who's been fantastic in keeping us in the loop of what's going on. But I'd be surprised if it got past Christmas.
Is it now the time for this government to intervene?
Well, the government is trying to intervene, and there are lots of discussions going on in the background. And my personal view is they have to, because again, getting to new green steel is one thing, but if you build a new steel plant, that takes time, right? It's going to take 2 or 3 years to do. In the meantime, we have to keep that primary steel making capability. So the government have to allow a bridge to that new investment. If they turn it off today, there's a real risk that that new investment never actually happens. Because why? If you allow imports of steel that are cheaper from high carbon intensive areas that also have lower employment rights, obviously huge problems, lower wages. So that's why, and obviously state subsidised as well. You will never be able to get a commercial investment in the UK because it will always be cheaper to import.
Is that what Labour government should do?
Well, it's a review, and it should. I mean, I'm just interested that we've been talking about the debt. Then within the next sentence, we're talking about more government investment or more government spending. So there are reasons why we do need to spend more. We do need to invest. I do get it, and it's a strategic.
It's not quite government investment in that sense, though. It's government support of the private sector to be able to create growth.
Well, as long as it's not, for example, just completely the state de-risking every investment from the private sector, so that we basically cover all the costs and they make all the profits, and that's something that shouldn't happen.
But absolutely, but just to be on this specific thing, this is not the case here. So British Steel, and this is public information because it's in their accounts, lost over £400 million last year. That's more than £1 million a day. So this isn't the idea that the government are giving them money to be able to give back to shareholders abroad. That's not what this is.
I understand that, and I'm very much in favour of us protecting and ensuring that we have a strategic asset in this country that can do what it needs to do, and we need to be able to make virgin steel in this country. I don't shy away from that for a variety of reasons. But what I will say is that when the nationalised British Steel was privatised in the late 1980s, it was beginning to become a profitable enterprise. And then it was handed over, and it's gone through a succession of various private companies from around the world who've done what they've done, who haven't invested sufficiently, and it means that the government has had to hand over fist to these international corporations. So all I'm saying is, at one point, when it was publicly owned in the 1980s, it was making a profit, and we should focus on it.
Well, hang on, Elliot, and I'll come to you, Sonia. But, Elliot, do you agree, should the government be stepping in to save British Steel?
The problem is whenever you start using government subsidies to prop up an industry, you're taking money from a productive part of the economy and putting it into fundamentally an unproductive part of the economy. Now, steel is not the same as every other industry. It does have strategic importance, but we have to be very open about that fact. I think the idea that British steel can ever be competitive compared to Chinese steel and Indian steel, given the cheaper costs of producing over there and also the significant subsidies they pump in over there, I think is for the birds. And so ultimately we face a choice, do we just subsidise this industry in perpetuity, in which case it's going to cost a huge amount of money, given the pressures on public spending that we've discussed on this panel already. You then have to worry, you then have to wonder, is that actually a priority?
Well, I mean, we've been talking about it, but there's the headline in The Guardian. Sonia, UK steel industry calls for protectionist measures over glut driven by China. That would basically bridge the gap between the transfer to a sort of greener energy production and closing these blast furnaces.
It wouldn't allow that transition to happen.
No, but that's what they're calling for, some sort of protectionist areas. Is that right?
Well, I think there's something else that we haven't talked about here, which is all these job losses as well. So there's absolutely the strategic and national security point, but there's also the fact that this is a lot of job losses. It's something that government should have been planning for, seeing down the track and thinking, well, if there are 5,000, 6,000 people losing their jobs in a short space of time in this industry, what are we doing for them? Because we know from the 1970s and 1980s...
I mean, it's terrible, but there have been transition funds been made available.
Yeah, but are they enough, though?
No, they're not. But I'm just saying that there has been stuff that has been done.
But we know, it can't be about short-term support. So we know from the 70s and 80s that when people lose jobs as a result of deindustrialisation and they're out of work for a period of time, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. That actually carries huge costs for the state later on.
We're going to have
this is a bit of a misdirection, though, these people are going on to?
To be fair to the government, and this is something we saw when the Redcar Steelworks closed in 2015, that was the blueprint that in effect was created. The government put in 2015 nearly £100 million worth of support for people to be able to find alternative work or set up their own business. And actually, within 3 years, everybody had found an alternative job or set up their own business. Now, wages were lower than they were when they were working in the steel industry. The government have replicated that and are trying to help. The issue here is, fundamentally, you're looking at probably closer to 10,000 jobs. And you also have this problem with UK Steel, who are, from my point of view, completely behind the curve. You can put as many tariffs in the UK as you want, but if we're not producing our own steel, what's the point? It's literally like saying we're going to put a tariff on importing spaceships from China. It's like, well, nobody's importing spaceships from China. We don't produce them ourselves. So the tariffs make no sense whatsoever.
We're going to just a final word.
I was going to say it's really interesting because what we're getting to here is that the simple costs of producing steel, as we're saying, the cost effectiveness, there's something else here, isn't there? It's about what do we need as an economy and as a society. We need steel capacity. We need steel production. So whether China can make it cheaper, whether India can make it cheaper, the fact is that we need to be able to make it here. So that means that there are...
Can I make one very final point? Sorry,
right now, that's about 3 final points.
It flows on from yours, Clive. The biggest issue we have facing, actually most manufacturing in this country, but particularly the steel industry, are energy costs. And a huge proportion of energy costs are taxes and levies that are leveraged specifically on industry because they're trying to avoid it onto the general bill payer, which is fine, but we have to acknowledge that government policy is driving energy prices which make us uncompetitive. That's a government regulatory issue. That is not a commercial issue.
We're going to talk about something completely different for a moment. Matt Chorley, 5 Live presenter, joins us now. What are you doing this afternoon, Matt? Oh, hang on. We couldn't hear you for a moment. Start again. What are you doing?
Say it again. I've got Boris Johnson coming in.
Oh.
He's, I don't know if you know, he's out and about promoting something at the moment, so he's going to come and tell us all about it. I think in his only live interview. Oh. So very much anything could happen. I can't tell you yet what he said because he hasn't said it yet.
Right. So what are you going to ask him?
Well, I can't tell you that, can I? Because that'll undermine the whole interview, as we know.
What time's it happening, Matt?
I'm live on 5 Live from 2 o'clock, and he's coming in just after 3.
All right, thank you very much. Good to see you. Ben, you're an ally, or an ally of Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister and in frontline politics. What would you like to hear from him in that interview?
I mean, I think the interview's mostly about him selling a book, isn't it?
The book is Unleashed.
Unleashed, which apparently is coming out or about to come out. Not that I'm not here to promote it, but it'll be an interesting read. I mean, I've not been contacted, so I'm assuming I'm not in it.
Don't you do what every journalist and politician does? They go straight to the index. Is my name there?
I don't, because to be fair, I honestly don't read political biographies and autobiographies. But to be fair, I mean, this is Boris for you. I will end up reading Boris's because I suspect it'll be quite good entertainment. What
would you like to hear from him, Clive? Remember what time we're on?
That he's one of the millionaire tax exiles that's leaving the country. Perhaps that would be a good piece of news. I mean, look, on a more serious...
Sure his finances are
maybe an apology. Maybe some contrition. I've never seen that from him. So
all right.
Be a first.
Well, something else happening today is that Conservative MPs will vote this afternoon to eliminate one of the 4 candidates hoping to be the next Conservative leader. There they are, Kemi Badenoch, Robert Jenrick, James Cleverly and Tom Tugendhat. BBC's political correspondent Damien Grammaticus is in Central Lobby. What's actually happening, Damien?
Well, that voting is going to start in just a few minutes, and we will get the results 3:30-ish, we think. Now, facing those Conservative MPs, 121 of them, remember, it's a very small electorate, is a pretty clear choice, because you've got 2 candidates who topped the polls last time. So Robert Jenrick, who came first, who's offering a real focus on immigration, tackling immigration, taking on the Reform Party. Kemi Badenoch, who's also right and talking about a whole reworking of the state. She wants to take on the NHS, the civil service, the judicial system. Then you have the 2 more centrist candidates who tied for 3rd place. So there we have Tom Tugendhat and James Cleverly. Now, the person who was knocked out last time, interestingly, Mel Stride, has backed in this round James Cleverly. He says that the party was badly damaged, its reputation for economic competence suffered, needs someone who can restore that. He says that's James Cleverly. He had 16 votes. And here's a thought. If those 16 split, this is such a small electorate, and went to the 2, Tom Tugendhat and James Cleverly, they could knock out Kemi Badenoch. So small shifts can make a big difference. But the real question, I think, will be tomorrow. Who goes to the final two to the party membership? Will it be two from the right, one more central, one more right? We shall see.
We will be following it very closely. Damien Grammaticus, thank you very much. Ben, you haven't publicly declared who you're backing in this leadership contest. Is that because you don't like any of them?
No, actually, it's the opposite. I've said publicly.
Oh.
I like them all. Out of all of them, one that I knew the least, probably over the last few months, was Tom Tugendhat. And again, it was said there, seen as maybe the more centrist candidate. Actually, when you sit down with Tom and you understand his politics, he's actually a very sound centre-right individual on security, on China. Some of the economic stuff he's got is really interesting. The problem is he has a brand issue that, because he voted Remain in Brexit, a lot of what he says is seen through that prism, which I think is slightly unfair of him. I think cleverly, and I said this to himself at conference, the more people he gets in front of, the more the members like him. He's quite a personable character. Robert Jenrick is saying all of the right things that will appeal to the membership, particularly around immigration and some of the fiscal stuff. Whereas Kemi, in a similar way to Robert Jenrick, actually, is trying to appeal to the members, but much more on kind of a cultural basis rather than necessarily an economic one.
Which one of the candidates do you know the best?
I would say probably Robert Jenrick I know the best, but it's, I know them all reasonably well, but none of them particularly well. I don't know what that means, but I know them all reasonably well.
OK, well, let's have a look at this headline in The Guardian. Starmer's new Chief of Staff to make radical changes to Number 10 operations. This is, of course, the ongoing story about the sort of shake-up at Number 10 with the departure of Sue Gray. And incoming in that role is a man called Morgan McSweeney. Let's have a look at this headline from The Times. Says Sue Gray's sacking won't fix systemic Number 10 issues, officials warn. Do you agree?
Yeah, to an extent. I think the way that Number 10 works on the inside is clearly important. And when you've got two senior officials briefing against each other, that isn't a sign of a healthy, happy Number 10 in terms of getting things done. But at the end of the day, rearranging people may have an effect, but it cannot compensate for what is the vision of a Labour government. And I think that Labour has got into difficulties in the early months, partly because of personnel issues, but there's a bigger thing at stake, which is just the economic inheritance is dire and fiscal conservatism is ruling the day. So it's very hard for the government to have a vision when, as I was saying earlier, Cabinet ministers are told they can't spend any money. We don't know really what the plan is for child poverty or closing the attainment gap for DfE because they haven't got any money to achieve anything. So it's really difficult, and we may see a difference. Perhaps we will see Number 10 influence economic policy more, but I think that is the key to unlocking more of an idea of what this government is about.
How have you viewed it all?
Well, I think it speaks to the kind of highly centralised government that we have, that Number 10 has to be so hyper-functional in that sense and that everything depends on it. I mean, look, Morgan McSweeney, if we look at what he did in the Labour Party, there are lots of things that he did, but it was a huge centralisation of power. I think in a political party, that's possible. In government, that's going to cause bottlenecks if you're going to try to make sure every decision comes to you. I don't know if that's the case, but that's one possibility. That's a template they're going to use. But I think Sonia's right. One of the things that people like myself were saying for many years before was what's the vision? What is Starmerism? What does it stand for? What is it going to be? And that hasn't been answered yet. And there is a kind of split personality. At one side, there's fiscal responsibility, a fiscal conservatism, but on the other, they implicitly understand that where the public are at the moment, something that the four Conservative candidates haven't faced up to, is that people want investment in public services. And there's a tricky bind with the inheritance that we got and where we find ourselves with debt and GDP and so on.
Well,
so, it is difficult.
Well, Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, we played a bit of the interview he did with me at Labour Party conference, and he was a huge cheerleader for Sue Gray. Was she, in touch regularly with the mayors?
I mean, she was. She led all of the meetings with the mayors. Every month we have monthly meetings. I mean, after the election, I met with the Prime Minister, having not met him before, with Sue Gray. And I've spoke to Sue probably a couple of times a week since then. And she's been, from a personal point of view of me being able to deliver what I need to deliver, she's unblocked a whole load of things. She's been fantastic. She understands the levers to pull within the system to get things done.
So you think it's a shame she's gone too?
Well, I just hope that whoever they give me as my point of contact in Number 10 is as effective, because she's been extremely helpful. And I'm slightly worried that she's gone from a personal point of view.
Yeah, just to touch on something that we were discussing earlier, one of the things that governments have found it really difficult in recent years is getting the civil service to move and finding the levers to pull. And it's really interesting that she was appointed. She's clearly somebody that does know how to pull those levers. And I do wonder if her departure will make it more difficult for Keir Starmer to push his agenda through.
Yes, what do you make of that in terms of her role really was being given the first 100 days? Was it a comms problem, a communications problem, I should say?
I think it definitely was partly a comms problem, and you know there are rumours that she was in charge of the grid, and obviously then some of that comes back to her. But comms isn't just comms. Comms reflects vision. If you don't have vision, then the comms become more difficult. So I think there is a deeper underlying issue.
Thank you to all of my guests. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 11:15. Bye.